Welcome to part 1 of a commentary series through the book of Hebrews. This video will cover a general introduction to the book. Years ago, I had the opportunity to preach through the book of Hebrews, and I found it to be such a powerful book in so many different ways. And lately, I've been wanting to revisit this book, and so I thought maybe a good way to do that would be to do a teaching series through the book in a kind of video commentary format. I know that I'm excited to revisit this book, and I hope that you will benefit from it also. And in this first video, let's just talk about some introductory things related to the book of Hebrews. Hebrews is a book of the New Testament, and it's often called the epistle to the Hebrews. In other words, the letter to the Hebrews. But is the book really a letter? In some ways, it doesn't really seem like one. Most of the time in the New Testament, letters will start out with some kind of greeting, some introductory pleasantries and that kind of thing. But that's really not what we get at all in the book of Hebrews. Instead, the author just launches right away into a theological point about how God has spoken to us through his Son. Listen to what he says in the very first verses. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. That really seems like an unusual way to start a letter. But then whenever you get to the end of the book, you do see some features that are more characteristic of a letter. Listen to what the writer says in the last verses of the book. I appeal to you, brothers, bear with my word of exhortation, for I have written to you briefly. You should know that our brother Timothy has been released, with whom I shall see you if he comes soon. Greet all your leaders and all the saints. Those who come from Italy send you greetings. Grace be with all of you. Now that does sound like a typical way to wrap up a letter. Say hey to everybody for me, hope to see you soon, that kind of thing. But what's really interesting to me is what he says in verse 22. He says, bear with my word of exhortation. That phrase, word of exhortation, may refer to something very much like what we would call a sermon. For example, in Acts chapter 13, where Paul and Barnabas are visiting a synagogue in Antioch of Pisidia, while they're there, the synagogue leaders say to them, brothers, if you have any word of exhortation for the people, say it. To which Paul basically says, as a matter of fact, yes, I do have a word of exhortation. And he stands up in front of the people and he launches into a sermon and preaches Christ to them. A word of exhortation in that context was equivalent to a sermon. So at the end of Hebrews, when the writer says, bear with my word of exhortation, that could be an indication that what Hebrews is not simply a letter, but actually a written transcript of a sermon. Now, we don't know that for sure, but it is a really intriguing idea, and I think it's very possible, so it's worth keeping in mind. Another question we could ask about the book of Hebrews is, when was it written? Now, the reality is that determining dates for books in the Bible is virtually always going to involve some amount of speculation and estimation. Most of the time, the best that we can do is just give a ballpark estimate. But we can say with confidence that Hebrews was written in the 1st century AD. And more specifically than that, most conservative estimations would say that the book was written sometime between AD 60 and 70, probably somewhere in the mid-60s. Now, there's a really good reason to think that Hebrews was written prior to 70 AD. And that's because that was the year when Jerusalem was besieged by the Romans and ultimately destroyed, along with the temple in Jerusalem. And that historical event was monumentally significant, especially from a Jewish perspective. Now, consider that Hebrews is written to Jewish Christians. That's why it's called Hebrews, after all. And the writer has a lot to say to them about Jewish customs and the sacrificial system that would have been observed in the context of the temple. And on top of that, part of his whole argument in the book is the superiority of Christ and the new covenant, and that what Christ has done has taken away any need to participate in those older systems. And he does all of that without mentioning the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple even one time. And that strongly suggests that this book was written prior to that event. Just like how if you were to pick up an American history textbook and you found that it didn't say anything about 9/11, you would pretty much have to assume that that textbook was written before 9/11, because otherwise, surely it would have said something about it. And in a similar way, given that Hebrews doesn't say anything about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, which occurred in 70 AD, it seems fairly certain that the book was written prior to that event. And again, the usual estimate that's given is sometime in the mid-60s AD. Another huge topic related to this book is the question of who wrote it. Interestingly, the author never identifies himself.
Or herself. Agreed.
And that makes the book a little bit mysterious in a way. But at the same time, it's not the only time that this happens in the New Testament. In fact, you may not often think of this, but none of the 4 gospel accounts explicitly tell us who their author is. Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not tell us who wrote them. The Gospel of John does give us some pretty definitive clues, but still, he never comes right out and says, "I'm John, and I'm the one writing this book." Speaking of John, also the letters of John in the New Testament don't have an explicit mention of who their author is. And yet, most Christians, it seems to me, are perfectly comfortable holding to the traditional authorship of the 4 Gospels or the letters of John. And I think the reason for that is because those traditional views are so well established in the history of the church from even the earliest days that we would really need very, very good reasons to dispute or overturn those traditional views. And we don't have good reasons to do that. So now let's bring this back to Hebrews. Is there a traditional view on the authorship of Hebrews? There is, and it's that Hebrews was written by the Apostle Paul. This is often referred to as the Pauline authorship of Hebrews. Pauline is also the name of the damsel in distress from Donkey Kong. But here it's just an adjective that means from Paul or having to do with Paul. And it does seem to me that the Pauline authorship of Hebrews is a minority viewpoint today, but it hasn't always been that way. In fact, for most of church history, it's been the majority viewpoint from even the earliest days. And I'll just say personally that that's a viewpoint I'm happy to take also, because at the end of the day, I don't think that the reasons for doubting Paul's authorship are good enough. Now, to be clear, there are arguments against Paul, and there are arguments for other people like Luke or Barnabas or Apollos. People make cases for all of those individuals as the author of this book. And there's a lot that we could talk about there, but I'm afraid that if I dove too deeply into those things in this video, it would really get too long and bloated. So what I hope to do is in the future, I'll put out a video that is specifically focused on that question of the authorship of Hebrews. So you can look out for that soon, Lord willing. But with all that said, even though I am personally content with the view that Paul wrote Hebrews, number one, I want to recognize that I could be wrong. And number two, I want to be charitable, and I don't want to lay any stumbling block for viewers that may disagree with me on that. And so I do intend in this series to refer to the author in a neutral way, I'll just stick to the normal convention of referring to him as the author or the writer, because I do think at the end of the day, we should be able to agree that knowing and understanding the inspired truth that comes to us from this book is more important than being right about whoever the author was. So with that question of authorship set aside for now, let's ask, what is the book of Hebrews actually about? It's 13 chapters long, which is on the longer end for a New Testament epistle. And obviously the writer has a lot of things to say in the book. But are there some unifying themes that tie the book together? I believe there is. And first I'll mention a simple 3-word statement that a lot of people have used to summarize the book of Hebrews. And it's this: Jesus is better. Jesus is better. In fact, words like better or more or greater occur about 25 times throughout this book. The book of Hebrews is about the superiority of Christ. His superiority over all the prophets who came before, his superiority over all the angels in heaven, over Moses and the law and the sacrificial system. The new covenant that Christ mediates is better than the old covenant. Over and over again, the writer is going to emphasize this idea of the superiority of Christ. And we could call that the theological theme of the book. In other words, that's what it's calling us to believe about Christ. But there is another theme folded in with that, which we might call the practical theme. In other words, what is this book calling its readers to do? And that practical theme is perseverance. Over and over again, the writer of Hebrews tells his readers to persevere in their faith, to not give up. And in fact, he has some pretty strong warnings throughout the book in the case of those who don't persevere and fall away instead. Remember, this is a book that's written to Hebrew Christians. And imagine what it would be like to live your whole life in the customs and traditions of Judaism. And then when you come to faith in Christ, you find that it's actually not easy. These people had left the comfort of their familiar religion and lifestyle to follow Christ. So now whenever persecution comes along and things get tough, it's easy to see how they might begin to say to themselves, you know, we had it pretty good in Judaism. Why don't we just go back to that old life that we knew and loved? That would have been a real temptation for them. And that is why the writer of Hebrews constantly urges them onward in this book. He says, don't give up, don't fall away. Keep your eyes on Christ. Keep running this race that's been set before you. The practical theme of the book of Hebrews is perseverance. And that is my general introduction to the book of Hebrews. I hope it was helpful to you. Keep in mind that I do hope to put out another video soon that will specifically focus on that question of the authorship of Hebrews. So you can be looking out for that. I hope you'll keep watching this series that I do through Hebrews or anything else that I might put out as well. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to, or maybe even if you don't want to and you just want to be nice. But in any case, thanks for watching today. And until next time, fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man.